Welcome, everybody. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and thrilled to be with you today. So we've been on a long journey. We read the entirety of what exists of Hannah Arendt's last uncompleted book, The Life of the Mind. We then read, because the last part of The Life of Mind was on judgment, which was never written. We have now read through this little book that was published by Ronald Beiner, Hannah Arendt's Lectures on Kant's Political Philosophy, which are not in any way a replacement for what would have been in the final part of The Life of the Mind, but are often thought to be one of the main places where Arendt articulates what she means by judgment. It's not the only one. Another important text, which I've quoted from a bunch during the last few weeks or months, is The Crisis of Culture, which is an essay in the lecture series or in the essays between past and future, and especially in the last 5 or so pages of that text, I think is one of the most important texts to understand what Arendt means by judgment. We finished the actual lecture course last week, and today we're focusing on a short paper. Ronald Beiner calls it seminar notes. And as Jerry Cohn said to you in conversation last week when he and I were talking about it, that's actually a mistake. They're not seminar notes. So it's published in this book at the end of this book, but it's also published in Thinking Without a Banister, Jerry Cohn's second volume of Hannah Arendt's Essays and Understanding, on page 387 forward in Thinking Without a Banister. And in that publication, there's a long introductory note that Jerry provides, which I think is helpful. And so I'll just start by letting you know that these were not seminar notes as Beiner had written. They were, it was actually a paper. And so Arendt taught this advanced seminar on Kant's critique of judgment at the New School. And in the first session, she said that everyone in the seminar would have to write a paper on one section of Kant's critique of judgment. And she would offer an example in the second seminar meeting. And this was the paper she brought in and presented in the second seminar. It's also important to know something that Jerry says in these notes, which is that when she was working on The Life of the Mind and near the end, and she was about to start the section on judgment, she couldn't find her own copy of the paper. And she called up Jerry and asked him to send her his. She then found it. And we have no idea to what extent, again, it would have served as a foundation for this third volume on judgment. But I think it's fairly clear that this is one of the texts that, if you're actually interested in her theory of judgment, I think has to be at the center of your study and reflection. And Jerry's right that it hasn't really been it hasn't been taken up so much. Why is hard to say. There's not much discussion about it in the literature. So it's short. It will be a chance for us, I hope, to review a bit what we've done. Let me also just say one thing about next week. As you know, it says on the schedule, and I've mentioned it, that Shayla Ben-Habib was going to speak with us. She's not going to be able to, which is too bad. But we have a great replacement, our new postdoctoral fellow who'll be joining us next year. Nick Dunn is actually, his specialty is Arendt and Kant on judgment. And from the few conversations I've had with him, he knows more about this than anyone I've ever met. And he and I are going to have a conversation about it next week. So I'm very excited about that. So I don't know if Nick is here. He can introduce himself.
I am.
You are.
Hi, everyone.
Hello. Welcome. So you want to just say hi? Introduce
Yeah.
briefly.
Great to be here. Currently in McGill, but on my way to Bard here in a couple months, and really excited to join the Hannah Arendt Center in the Bard community, and definitely looking forward to chatting with you next week as well.
Great. So yeah, so next week at this time, Nick and I will have a conversation about Hannah Arendt and judgment, and I think it'll be really worthwhile. So I hope you tune in. In this particular text, and Nick, by the way, feel free to correct me now that you're here, whenever you feel, or supplement what I'm saying. Okay, imagination. We've talked a fair bit about imagination in our conversations. Arendt at one point calls imagination, the solution to a problem, right? The problem is, as she says on page 64 to 65, why then should taste, not beginning with Kant, but ever since Gratian, be elevated to and become the vehicle of the mental faculty, right? And judgment, in turn, that is not the judgment that is simply cognitive and resides in the senses, that gives us the objects we have in common with all things that have the same sensual equipment, but judgment between right and wrong. Why should this be based on this private sense of taste? And she says the solution to this riddle is imagination. Imagination, the ability to make present what is absent. That's in the end of the 10th session. And then 11, 12, and 13 are in many ways an attempt to work out why it is that imagination, and how it is that imagination is an answer to this riddle of why taste should be the a private sense, should be the model for, or the foundation for judgments of right and wrong, of public judgments. We've gone through it in the lectures, but let's go through it and what she says about it here in this short paper. As she says many times, right? This is just basic Kant. Imagination is the faculty of making present what is absent. It's thus a faculty of representation. It represents what's not here. So it's not the same as memory. She says, deeper than memory. So memory is a faculty for representing what has happened in the past. But imagination is bigger than that. It includes not just what's happened in the past, but it could also even be an imagination of what might happen in the future. And it could also be what she calls a productive imagination, or productive faculty, which the artist has of producing something that's never been seen through like a centaur or something of the sort. But it is, when I do represent something that is not present, I have an image in my mind, and it's this role of this image that's going to play a big part here. She also says that the imagination, as this image that I have in my mind that represents things that are not present, is connected to being. It's connected to the actual, what Parmenides called nous, or thinking, or true being, what it is. It's what when we see something, when I see you guys, when I see the book, okay, I see a book. The book is, the intuition I have, what hits my eyes and into my brain, but the representation of it is not something that is sensed. It's an image that, well, where does it come from, right? And it's a kind of, that's part of the mystery of this idea of imagination. And she says there are two, that imagination as this power, this faculty of our mind to create an image that is not an intuition, but is a representation of something that's not there, goes in two directions, or has two plays two roles in our faculties. One is in cognition, and that's the way we know things. And this is what she discusses in her first critical work, the critique of pure reason. And in that sense, the imagination is connected to what she calls the schemata, which is going to be what heavily discussed here. And on the other sense, in the question of judgment of right and wrong, of beautiful and ugly, it's going to be the imagination is going to be connected to the question of examples. And so in order to understand the imagination, we have to understand the power that Kant gives it. And it's extraordinary in his work. So she says the essay is broken into 4 parts. So this first part is the sort of an introduction. And now in part 2, she says the role of imagination for our cognitive faculties is perhaps the greatest discovery Kant made in the critique of pure reason. It's an extraordinary claim. For our purposes, it is best to turn to the schematism of pure concepts of understanding, which provides schemata for cognition. And so here's where she says, to anticipate the same faculty, imagination is going to provide schemata for cognition and examples for judgment. In this sense, in cognition, right, 2 things have to be combined, right? If I'm going to say this is a book and I'm going to create and I have knowledge that this is a book, what do I have to combine? I have to combine my intuition of senses hitting my eyes, going through to my brain, which have nothing to do with book per se, but are colors and maybe weight and who knows what other senses are coming into me. And I have to combine that manifold of intuitions, which Kant calls it, with a concept which says a book is, how do we define a book? Maybe a bound, or maybe today an ebook. It's not bound, but a coherent, lengthy, narrative, conceptual articulation of a theme or of a story or whatever it is that one can read. I don't know what's a good definition of a book. So how do we combine a concept of the book with an intuition of the book so that we can know that we're talking of a book? And she says we need a synthesis. We need somehow to synthesize of the manifold of intuitions with the concept. And what allows that to happen, she says, is the imagination. The synthesis of the manifold is what first gives rise to knowledge. It gathers the elements for knowledge and unites them into a certain content. This synthesis is the mere result of the faculty of imagination, a blind but indispensable function of the soul, without which we should have no knowledge whatsoever, but of which we are scarcely ever conscious. The imagination is this blind but indispensable function of the soul. It's what makes knowledge possible. It's what allows us somehow to take the manifold of intuitions and combine it with a concept. And then the last sentence, this is on this of this description, is that, and the way imagination produces the synthesis is by providing an image for a concept. Such an image is called a schema. All right, that's the key sentence in some ways. What the imagination does is, as a faculty, as she calls it, a blind but indispensable function of the soul, right? Like there's a certain kind of mystery involved here. But what she says is somehow deep in our soul, in a way we can't penetrate, we're able to take the manifold of intuitions that come from looking at a book or looking at my pen and combine them with a concept of book or pen. And the way we can do that, she says, is we provide an image for the concept. What does that mean? It means that somehow, somewhere in our soul, we don't only have an image of this book or all these books. We have an image of the book, which is not yet the concept of the book. And this image of the book, which is not a concept, is the schema, the schemata. And she describes this through a number of examples, right? She says that if you see a house or a book or whatever, you have the particular house or the particular book, right? If I recognize a house, this is in part 3. If I recognize a house, this perceived house also includes how a house in general looks. But of course, you'll never see a house in general. As soon as you sketch a house, it's a particular house. And yet somewhere in your soul, in this blind way that your soul works, we all have in ourselves an image of a house, this schemata. Plato called this image of this schemata, this image of the house, the eidos, the idea, the general form, which you can never see, but only can be seen in the eyes of the mind. It's like an image, but it's not an image because there's no particular to which image of, which is why Kant calls it a schema. And this schema exists between thought, our concept, and sensibility, the manifold of our intuitions. It's kind of like a pure a priori image for Kant. So that's section 3. And so far, she's, gone through looking at imagination, I think, in a fairly provocative way, but in a way that's not that foreign to most Kant scholars who focus on the imagination as a faculty in the critique of pure reason. But now she says in part 4 that there are a few decisive points, and here's where she starts to get going. His first one is that in perception of this particular table, there's contained not only a concept of the table, but an image, a schemata of the table, and that you can't perceive the particular book or table without the schemata, without this image, without imagination. And thus, imagination is necessary not only for thinking, but for perception. You can't even perceive something without imagination, right? I mean, how can you perceive a book if you don't already have the schemata of a book? It would just be a bunch of intuitions. And while the schema of a book or table is valid for all particular tables, without it, we would just be surrounded by a manifold of objects. Okay, fine. That's the second conclusion she draws, or points that are decisive. Hence, she says, without the ability to say table as a concept, but also as an imaginary schema or schemata, we could never communicate. We could never talk to each other. And then the 4th and 5th points are where she actually gets into what's really meaningful for us in dealing with judgment. In point 4, she says, the critique of judgment deals with reflective judgments as distinguished from determinate ones. So we've talked about this throughout this discussions. A determinate judgment is a logical judgment where a particular is logically subsumed under a general statement. So, all all those who cause harm by their wrong must be killed by drinking poison hemlock is a general statement. Socrates is one who caused harm by his wrong, therefore Socrates must die. These are logical statements. Of course, in such a, it's a logic, that's not a pure logical statement because it's based on a judgment, namely that Socrates is a philosopher who corrupted the young. But logical one would be, a square has 4 equal sides or whatever, and this thing has 4 equal sides, therefore it's a square. That's the difference between a determinative. So what is a reflective judgment? A reflective judgment is one where you have no logical rule. You have to make the judgment from the particular itself. And then in the 5th part of part 4, she says, finally, our sensibility seems to need imagination, not only as an aid to knowledge, cognition through schemata, but in order to recognize sameness in the manifold. As such, it is the condition of all knowledge. The synthesis of imagination prior to apperception is the ground of the possibility of all knowledge, especially of experience. Then she says, if that's the case, if imagination is necessary for all knowledge of experience, she says the importance for this for our purposes is that sensibility and understanding meet in producing it through the imagination, in the cognition, in the critique of pure reason, and in the critique of judgment. The imagination is what allows us to connect what? Not intuition and concept, but this is the harder question. It allows us to connect it allows us to connect a particular act with a judgment. And how does it do that? It allows us to somehow say, this person is courageous. This person is good. This artwork is beautiful. How do we do that? Well, just like there's this blind faculty of imagination, which produces an image of the book, which allows us to come up with the concept of book and create a synthesis between these manifolds and the concept. We now create through our imagination another image, an image of an exemplar of beauty, right? Or of courage. Achilles is an exemplar of courage. Okay, so what does that do? It gives us an image of courage in our mind that doesn't, and we've never seen Achilles, but it gives us this image. And then if we see Zelensky, we can somehow take the manifold of intuitions and the particular thing we see in someone like Zelensky and say, he's courageous. And we do it because the example allows us, the example of Achilles allows us to have an image of what courage is, so that Zelensky and then becomes another example of courage that we can apply to people. So she says, Kant accords to examples the same role in judgments that the intuitions called schemata have for experience and cognition. Examples play a role in both reflective and determinative judgments. That is, whenever we are concerned with particulars. So even in determinative judgments, right? So in the critique of pure reason, we read about the judgment is a peculiar talent which can be practiced only and not taught. You can't teach someone how to make judgments. You have to show them. You have to do it. The only way to teach morals, Kant says in the groundwork, is by acting morally and providing an example to others about how to act morally that inspires them, that calls upon them to also want to act that way. The examples lead and guide us, and thus she says they have what Kant calls exemplary validity. The example is the particular that contains in itself or is supposed to contain a concept or a general rule. If you were a Greek, you would have in the depths of your mind the example of Achilles. Imagination is again necessary. You must have Achilles present despite his absence. If we say of somebody that he is good, we have in the back of our minds the example of St. Francis or Jesus or whoever you have in mind. The judgment has exemplary validity to the extent that the example is rightly chosen. Or she says, to take another example, I can speak of Napoleon Bonaparte as a particular man, but the moment I speak of Bonapartism, I make an example of him. The validity of this example will be restricted to those who possess the experience of Napoleon, if not of his contemporaries, then as heirs of a particular historical tradition. Most concepts in historical and political sciences are of this restricted nature. They have their origin in a particular historical incident and then proceed to make it exemplary, to see in the particular what is valid for more than one case. So to pull this back to some of the conversations we've had, in order to make a judgment, you need an imagination, you need an example. And the example requires that you not have seen the example, but that you are in some way aware of it. You have to have some experience of it. And this returns us back to this discussion we've had the last few weeks about the sensus communis, spoken in Latin, not a common sense, not simply what we all share and is common and everyone knows, but this idea of, in some sense, a shared experience, one that is never static, that we always have to constantly woo people to. So the idea of a judgment in taste, in art, or in morals, not morals, in good and bad, is that we, in making the judgment, we claim that it's not just my subjective particular judgment, that it's good for everyone, but it's a claim that I have to constantly woo people to. I have to constantly seek to persuade them, and I can never argue it. I have to, in a sense, speak it, show it, and try and make people see what I see, namely the example and the synthesis of that example with what I'm saying. So if I say Zelensky is courageous, I have to be able to both, we all have to have some common experience of Zelensky, but we also have to have a common experience of what we mean by courage, which is going to come through examples. And the examples are going to be things like we all share, whether it's Achilles or George Washington, or whoever you have in mind. That it's in this sense that imagination provides this synthesis between a particular that you're judging and the claim of it is courageous, or it is beautiful, or it is good. That imagination is the solution, right, as she says it, to the problem of why we take a private judgment and make it the foundation for politics and political judgment. And that's where we'll end it for now. And happy to engage in questions and discussion. There's two ways to engage in that discussion. One is through the chat. So please do be respectful of each other if you are going to speak in the chat. The other is to raise your hand and under the reactions button and engage in the conversation. I just want to begin and ask Nick, since he's here, and as I said, he knows this stuff quite well. Is there anything he'd like to add before I get going, before we get going?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to to talk about even in this really short section. Maybe I'll wait and just sort of hop in
That's
as the
great.
discussion.
Feel free to let me know if you want to, and that would be great.
Sure.
All right. So we're going to start with Adolf. You're up.
Thank you. So my question is, this is like a pretty big question. I thought your presentation was great, but I'm trying to get, and this is like, tell me if I'm too out there, but I'm trying to get from imagination to amor mundi, right? Without this like sensus communis, right? So like basically like, let's say hypothetically speaking, like I am an abolitionist in the South in the 1800s. I am against, like the Holocaust, and I live in Germany during Hitler, that kind of thing, right? So I'm using my imagination to arrive at Amor Mundi, and yet like I don't want to become like, I guess like what is it, like Dostoevsky, the underground man. I don't want to be crazy, So it's basically just like does Arendt have a concept in terms of like going from imagination, living in your head, to amor mundi when there is no way of participating in some kind of sensus communis?
No, that's a great question. So amor mundi, right? And you gave two great examples of it, is somehow this belief that we love the world. The world is lovable in spite of its evil, in spite of all the terrible things that can happen. And that sort of belief that somehow the world is worth, that we are thankful, that we have gratitude for being born and being in a world in spite of chattel slavery, brutal chattel slavery, in spite of genocide and the Holocaust. And so, in a sense, that idea of amor mundi is a judgment, right? That's why this is such a really fascinating question. And she calls it, in some of her writing, a judgment of reconciliation. It's a judgment to reconcile with the world. Now, as I think we've spoken about a couple times, I don't know if you've been here when we did it. It's not a Hegelian judgment of reconciliation, because for Hegel, reconciliation is the claim that what is rational. And insofar as what is rational, even if it seems awful, it has some purpose, and it will be part of the unfolding spirit of the world, freedom, and it will lead us in the right direction. So we know that even if what seems awful will end up being rational. Arendt rejects the Hegelian reconciliation of judgment, and she says that the judgment of reconciliation is that the world is not rational, and it may not be progressing. She's not, not a believer in progress. And yet, we have to somehow love it and be grateful for it and embrace it. And that's the judgment. And so now the question that you're asking, which is a great question, really, the more I'm thinking about it, the better it is in my mind, is what's the image? What's the schemata? What's the image of gratitude? Where does that fundamental gratitude come from? If we're going to actually, Arendt writes this poem about Amor Mundi as she's walking through Riverside Park, where she is thinking about the Holocaust and comes to, I love the world, right? And it's in this poem, it's that moment. So we're walking down the park. What is it that the image is? What's the example that underlies Amor Mundi? Yeah. And I don't know if I have an answer to that off the top of my head. I think, you could, in some sense, it's simply the word she uses is gratitude, Dankbarkeit, yeah. Or the idea of being thankful that you're alive, that you want, to be rather than not be. The word that I'm translating reconciliation is the German Versöhnen. And it's an intensification of a kind of blessing. I don't know. Does anyone, I think it's a great question. What is the sort of exemplar of Amor Mundi? It has to be something, she at times invokes a Christian idea, even though she's Jewish, the glad tidings, right? Blessings. And I'm mentioning these not because I think any one of them is right, but I think the point is it's a kind of image of the goodness, not the goodness, it's the wrong word, of the world as having sense, even in its evil, and that it's better that we are here than not. The good tidings is the Christian idea. There are other ideas as well. I'm open to other people offering some ideas here because I think it's a great question.
Can I say something quickly?
Yeah.
When you said like she had this idea of Amor Mundi walking through the park, I thought that might be the image, the park.
Okay, I mean, yine, right? I mean, yes and no, but it's not the park. I don't think the park is what makes us thankful for being in the world despite the Holocaust. Maybe.
No, but the park as like this mix between like tamed wilderness or designed nature, not the park itself, but as an image of like the two coming together.
Okay, that's closer to something. Yeah.
Doesn't Jerome Cohen, doesn't Jerome Cohen cast doubt on this in the introduction to Thinking Without a Banister?
I don't remember off the top of my head.
Yeah, he does. He suggests that he's doubtful about it in a couple of places.
Doubtful about what? What's the it?
Well, the it is her espousal of that Amor Mundi.
Okay. I'd have to go back and look at that. If you have a citation or a page number, I'll look at it.
Oh, well.
We're not reading that text right now, but I happen to have it in front of me. So.
Yeah, a couple of places he directly questions that. And of course, I can't find it quickly, but I will look and.
All right, come back and let me know.
Yeah, but I was almost shocked to see that.
Okay.
All
right.
May I jump in just for a moment?
Yeah.
Roger, Bill here. I spent a breakfast speaking with my husband about an article in the New York Times yesterday about suicide as a social protest. And I feel like the question is a very, very astute question, but of course, and I have the infrastructure of a Southern Baptist, but I don't have the faith that the world is a terrible place. And the way I might answer the question, or I think on her behalf, is stay in it.
Yeah.
That is how you actually, that's the image. How do you stay in it? Now, by extension, do you have children? Do you have children? Do you care about things? Do you care about the DNA in your body that has given you this body that you have? And if you have the love of the world, are you in love with the whole process of creation, of which you are a part? It's a hard line. Don't kill yourself. That is one. Is that an image? It's an action. Kind of dark, but I don't know what else. Why don't you die?
Why and why? But so what's the image for stay in it? I mean, we're all going to die, right? Death is
Love something or someone other than yourself.
That's yeah.
Now, is that Christian?
That's the question. I mean, that's what that's funny. I mean, she does the one image that I keep thinking that she comes back to is this Christian image of glad tidings. I have to say that's somewhat it's there, and I'm trying to think of a non-Christian image that she uses for that. And I'm not the other one is Amor Mundi, which is a pagan or Roman idea, not necessarily a Christian one.
But do we need an image, or is it an action?
Well,
what are you doing that demonstrates your love of the world? Base principle is stay in the world,
right,
and love something.
So what
love something of yourself.
I think that's
so I don't
right.
know. That's I don't know about image, but that is definitely a practice. The Buddhists would say it's a practice. Stay in the world.
But what the reason I'm asking for an image, just to make it clear, is because insofar as I'm suggesting that Amor Mundi is a judgment, and thus reconciliation is a judgment, which she argues it is in a number of places. If we take her seriously here, the judgment is only possible based on an imagination of an exemplary of an example which is an image. It could be the image of Christ coming down, but that's a religious image, and one that was not part of her religion. And I'm not sure that that's an image that's going to be acknowledged by everyone, although I think even non-Christians can sort of understand it. So you said an action. I think in some ways, someone who's suffered the worst and yet decides to live could be an exemplary image of for the kind of judgment of Amor Mundi or reconciliation that we're talking about. So people who suffered extraordinary things and yet chose to live and in some way become an example of people who love not life but the world enough to stay in it. But I'm just trying to think of who's the exemplary figure for someone who suffers that and yet loves the world, not just chooses to stay alive out of fear of death, that's different, but chooses to love the world and stay in it.
Roger, it sounds like a messianic hope to me.
A messianic hope. I'm asking for who's an example of somebody who acts in that way. Is that?
I feel like in terms of image, is just in terms of just picking up what folks are saying, I think like the image of staying in it sometimes is fighting in it, right? Like for example, like the French resistance, or fighting in it, like activism during Trump. And I feel like sometimes one of the issues with that is that it runs up on really insane contradictions, and sometimes it asks for these like massive risks. It's like, what would the French resistance have been? Like, no one really remembers the German resistance. Like, what would the French resistance have been if they had lost, or something of the sort? And it's like some of these things, it's like they're romanticized, but it's like, are we actually willing to assume the consequences of certain forms of staying in it, especially when those around us are telling us that the only way to love this thing is to stay in it in a certain way. Like, what would happen if the US were attacked like Ukraine? What would staying in it mean?
I think that's a good point. You know, and there's all these polls that have come out in the last few months saying that, you know, over 50% of the Americans say that if America were attacked by the Russians, they would leave. And it's been politicized because Democrats apparently would leave more than Republicans. So people politicized it. But even total, 50% would leave, right? Anyway, it was a great, go ahead. Someone's.
Well, for me, Nelson Mandela is an example of somebody who endured enormous suffering and stayed in it, and luckily for the world, did amazing things, but 27 years in prison.
Yeah, I think that's a good example. I mean, courage is the first virtue of politics, because in courage, not life, but the world is at stake. And so someone like Mandela or anyone who acts courageously puts their life at risk for the world, and they fight for the world. And that's what Amor Mundi is. It's a love of the world where you're willing to sacrifice your own life for the sake of the world. And that's those are the kind of exemplary, I think that's a good example of exemplary actions for people who are willing to fight, not for a particular end, but for the world itself. And so I'll take that.
Can I read something that Jerome Cohen wrote? You have that book on page 15.
Roman numeral 15, you mean?
Yeah, Roman numeral 15. He writes, the spontaneous newness of action, the godlike Thalmazine, or wonder with which it endowed the ancient world, I believe, is what originally gave rise to the notion of amor mundi, love of the world, frequently associated with Arendt. And then the next page, Roman numeral 16, he writes, and since at the bottom of the first paragraph, and since thinking's reconciliation to the world is hardly the same as love, all of this tends to make one a bit skeptical of the worldly wise Hannah Arendt's Amor Mundi in her later years.
All right. So, I mean, the first part is I think, consistent with what we've said. The second part, thinking's reconciliation with the world, is actually Hegelian, not Arendtian. So,
Okay.
you know, to that extent, I think Arendt disagrees with that interpretation of Amor Mundi. All right. But I'll take that up with Jerry in a separate conversation.
All right.
All right. Because that's
Thanks.
not what we're talking about today. Great. Thank
Yeah.
you very much, Adolf. That was really wonderful. And if anyone else wants to add to it at some point, let me know. But next, Susan.
So I always have problems with her use of things like soul and intuition. It sounded like you were using intuition and sense perception as the same thing, but it always confuses me when we're talking about the mind, and suddenly this is something that's going on in the soul, and that's at the base of the whole thing. And she doesn't ever, maybe I'm wrong, but as far as I know, she doesn't ever really reconcile those two things. So I always get quite confused.
Yeah. I mean, so part of this is that this is a lecture course on Kant. And Kant uses the intuition translates the the German word for the bringing of the sense into your body or into your mind.
Anschauen.
Anschauen. Yeah. So it's a sort of schauen, looking in, but and so intuition is used here not in the sort of more, you know, spiritual sense of having an intuition, but of actually, you know, being impacted by sense perception. So I don't know if that, I mean, that's not going to help with the soul. But so yeah, in this particular text, intuition has a very sort of almost mechanical aspect to it. Okay. Is that helpful?
Yes, that's very helpful. I forget where it was that she also said something about intuition was the basis of philosophy, something like that. I remember we read that quite a while ago. I can check out where that was, but that again surprised me to hear her say that, and maybe she's using it in the same way.
Are you sure it's intuition and not wonder, or what?
No, there was. I'll check. I would have to go dig it out, but I'm pretty positive because when I saw it and I said, you know, women have intuition and it's considered, you know, put down for it, and suddenly philosophers, that's the basis of philosophy, and that's, you know, lauded. So anyhow, I think she says something, but maybe she's using it in the same way there as it's being used here. So yes, that's helpful.
Okay, great. Jeff.
Hi. I guess this has been fascinating. I've been reading Kant too, so it's been interesting. Section 3 is basically what I'm focused on mostly. The schematism is probably my favorite thing in the critique of reason, right? And when I say schematism is essentially, it does what the concept does without the concept. And I think you said almost that in your intro. It's sort of like the replacement for the concept inside of the imagination or intuition, right?
Right.
It's doing that job. It really works well with in a computer programming sense too, which perhaps why I caught into it. So, and actually at the very end of section 2, she writes that Kant suggests that imagination is actually the root of the other cognitive faculties. So anyway, it reminds me a lot of Eleanor Rausch, and I just looked up that her idea of concepts of categorization is being developed right about this time. I mean, her books are published like in '78 and so forth, and in the early '80s. And that is basically
again, about 1778 or 19?
No, 1978. So at the time that Arendt is writing, Eleanor Rausch is cooking up this idea that a category is just a collection of examples, as opposed to the sort of the Platonic idea that there's some essential quality that everything that belongs to the category share.
But I don't think that's Kant's idea or Arendt's idea that a category is a collection of examples.
Well, I think it should be because look at the beginning of section 3 here, the one spot where I would really correct her here, she says, if I recognize a house, this is the last line of 81.
Yeah.
This perceived house would also include how a house in general looks. That's murky at best. What I wrote was, no, rather it is something we intuit would be called a house by others. In fact, the only thing that joins all the
How do you have a house? You don't know what a house is.
You do because you know what other people would call a house. And that actually gets us straight into Arendt's category of having having a community of observers. But in other words, we get an idea that this would go with a child development thing too, right? Is that we just get an idea of what people would call a house. Mm-hmm. And so we're basically, that doesn't require, in other words, you could have a collection of sort of exemplars, is what Rausch calls them, basically of what something is, and then we know what goes on. So the question is, what's just the worthy category of comparison? Do we know how to do it? So in other words, the intuition is working there without words, and then the concept is basically just the publicity, the public aspect of the concept, which is to say the name of the concept is really what it is. That's what joins everything together. That really allows the intuition to power understanding, I think, actually. And the understanding is really just like the outward facing version of the concept, which is to say the name of the concept, so that we know, how do we know we're talking about the same things? We give it the same concept. That's generally the idea. But it sort of, it brings politics then to concept formation, I think, is what makes it, is the cool angle that Arendt would have into this. But she doesn't quite go there, because in 4 she kind of backs off, and then, like I said, she makes it sound like there's some kernel inside that all the members of a category share, but that kernel is actually not inside it. It's the name that's applied to it.
Yeah, except, you know, you have in French house is chez, and in Russian it's dom, and in German it's Haus, and in America it's Haus. And I mean, there's a lot of different, I mean, the concept house, let alone the schema house or the image, at least for Kant and certainly for Arendt, and I think they're probably right here, has to come before any particular house. You can't build a house without the idea of a house. Otherwise, you would never build. Otherwise, you would never build it.
Well, but the thing is, you have to live somewhere, and then if something or someone says, "Oh,
people lived all sorts of places," and you don't have to live anywhere. You can live in the outside. You have to come up with some sort of idea before you build it. Unless, I mean, there has to be some idea there, and where that idea comes from is I mean, to upset Susan, a bit of a mystery. But you know, you can't even, yeah, I mean, someone built the first house. I don't know who was. They probably a cave, you know, or a hole in the ground, or whatever it was. But somewhere along the line, this idea of a structure emerged, but it had to, you know, and how it actually happens, who knows? But you know, it didn't start because, you know, I invited you over to my house for drinks and you said, "Oh, house." You know, it started a long time ago. Now, once it's in the language and there's different words for it and whatever, yeah, then you're right. The way children learn what a house is today is probably different than the way the first house emerged. And yet still, what Kant is going to say, and here I think I'm right, but Nick or someone can correct me if I'm wrong, it's our schema of a house is not based on a collection of examples of houses. It's something beyond all those examples.
I guess I'm an existentialist at heart, which is to say that the existence comes before the essence, which is that which is designated by the name, if there be such a thing. But thank you, though.
You're welcome. Fran.
I would like to read one sentence from page 73. It's at the start of the second third on the page.
You're in the 13th session, not imagination, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay. So the sentence is impartiality in Kant is called disinterestedness, the disinterested delight in the beautiful. And I have some vague sense of what this sentence could mean. But I want to know if I can relate impartiality to non-judgment first, and then second, spinning off from that, can I imagine a world that is non-judgmental, or like is in a world that's non-judgmental beauty possible?
So first of all, to your first question, no. Impartiality is not it can't be associated with non-judgment because it's the specific virtue of judgment. As she says right near where you read. Judgment, as at least as she understands it, has to be impartial and disinterested, because only when you liberate yourself from our partiality or our particular interests, can we begin to imagine a judgment that is good for everybody, universal, not universal. Universal is the wrong word, but common for all. And so impartiality is part of what it means to judge. And you can't be impartial, she says, without imagination and reflection, because imagination and reflection would allow us to imagine a place that doesn't exist, which is this place free from partiality. Okay, well, that was, I think, and I think that answers your first question.
I'm sorry, can you try one more time, because I didn't understand it.
Okay, well, maybe I misunderstood your question then. What your question was, can you have,
Like,
does impartiality mean non-judgment?
how is it related to it?
It's
Like,
well, impartiality is not about non-judgment, right? It's about judgment. Impartiality doesn't mean you don't make a judgment. Impartiality is the virtue of making a judgment. It's what you need in order to judge, but it's not lack of judgment.
okay.
And what was the second question again? I'm sorry, I lost it.
The second question was, let's imagine there's like a non-judgmental world, but judgments don't exist. Would in such a world beauty be able to exist?
I don't think so. I mean, that's one of these if the tree fell in the forest questions. And the answer from an Arendtian point of view is, well, no, because there's no tree or forest without a human world. There would be, who knows what there is without a human world. There are things, but they're not even things, because a tree and a forest only are as tree and forest in a human world. And so you can't ask, well, if there's no one there, is there a tree, would the tree fall in the forest? Because you need humans. Similarly, beauty is a human idea. So you're not going to have beautiful things without humans.
Okay.
Beautiful is a part of a judgment which comes from a community, a sensus communis. There's no, the Mona Lisa doesn't exist without judgment, nor does birdsong.
It does not exist without judgment?
Not as beautiful. I mean, because it's just sound waves until somebody makes a disinterested and large mentality judgment and woos other people to it, and there creates a community. No, I don't think there's anything beautiful for Kant.
But my idea was, and it's probably doesn't make any sense to you, but that if we get pleasure out of judgment, out of disinterested, could we then also get pleasure out of non-judgment in the sense of like taste? It's just there, you taste it. That could be pleasurable, and I would not have to necessarily make a judgment, maybe.
Well, and to the extent it's pleasurable, haven't I made a judgment that it's pleasurable and not awful? I mean, if I taste the ice cream and I don't know how to not make a judgment. Either I, yeah, or I, no.
Not necessarily. I don't know.
How would I not? I mean, if I taste it, I have to have some reaction to it.
I don't, only if I want to communicate it. Otherwise, if I want to communicate it to other people. Otherwise, maybe I don't have to make that judgment. And I can, like the ice cream and my tongue have like a different communication going. Who knows? I don't know.
I don't know. I think that even if you're not communicating, when you taste something, you make a judgment of, do I want to spit it out or not?
But what would be the use of that? Like I go through the world, I judge certain things, but not everything. What is the use of going through the park and say, whoa, this bench is really ugly? Like, what does the bench get out of that?
I'm not sure the bench gets anything out of it, but I get the pleasure of judging and being part of a world, a common world.
But the bench is part of the common world, no?
Yeah, but the bench isn't making the judgment. I am.
But the bench is the receiver of my judgment. So like, what does the bench do with that?
I don't think the bench does much with it. I don't think the bench receives. I mean, I'm assuming the bench isn't conscious.
I think like something happens to the bench, or like, this is my question. What happens to the bench if I do this judgment? Does it affect the bench or not? We know it affects probably subjects, but I'm more interested like in objects, because we judge a lot of objects.
Well, I mean, it only would affect the bench to the extent that if I judge it ugly and I mobilize to have people remove the bench. I don't know. I mean, I have to say I'm a little bit unsure of how to respond. I don't know where that goes.
It's okay.
I'm sorry. I'm not sure I'm getting it.
I'm just like, I don't understand judgment fully. And I was hoping that by understanding non-judgment or what that could mean, I would get like a better grasp of judgment. But I guess like if you don't understand the one and you try to approach it from the opposite side, it's still unclear to me. I don't know.
Okay. I'm going to have to, maybe we'll
Thanks for
come back to it. And maybe next week we can take it up.
Can I say something about this? I don't know if this is helpful or not, but hopefully I think gets to the crux of it. I think in Origins of Totalitarianism, Arendt comments that the alleged fascination that Hitler had on everyone was based in their desire not to make their own judgments. And so she really wants us to be in the habit of making judgments. I think this maybe is one of the strengths of Biner's interpretive essay too. So I think if you understand the imperative of us being in the habit of making judgments, of being connected to the world, then that maybe will help you understand, what's judgment and what's not judgment.
Yeah, I mean, what she says, if I remember it, Rachel, is right that at a time when people are afraid to judge and don't make judgments, someone who judges, even if their judgments are idiotic, like Hitler's, and they judge with confidence, those judgments will have a kind of persuasiveness that they shouldn't have, because we are simply fascinated with anyone who's willing to make judgments when so few of us are willing to make judgments. And I think that's something you see a lot today as well. We live at a time in which there's so much emphasis that don't judge. Who are you to judge? Relativism, And so when a political figure comes around and makes strong judgments, there's a kind of fascination with that person. And that's what she was talking about in the section. I think it's what the beginning of of the classless of chapter 10 of Origins. So it's a good point. Did you have another question, Rachel? You were next up, or go ahead. You're muted, so you have to unmute yourself.
I wrote a dissertation long ago on Arendt and the Greeks from kind of a feminine standpoint. So when imagination section 2 came up, I couldn't help but go back to the last chapter of Critique of Pure Reason, because there Kant gives us a little kind of sketch of the history of pure reason. And I think it's kind of interesting for our discussion today. And he lays out the sort of, just in a quick sketch, the difference between, that there has been a war going on. Well, actually, let me back up and say one thing. He says in the very last chapter of the Critique of Pure Reason that we're going to end up at the birthplace of philosophy, the infancy of philosophy. And I think what this means is that Kant actually takes us to the pre-Socratics, and even before that, the poets. And and I think this, shows the closeness actually between what Kant actually wants to do in the Critique of Pure Reason and what Arendt wants to do in the Critique of Judgment. He says that there's this contest going on between those who are the sensualists and those who are the intellectualists, and that this contest has been going on since before the schools of philosophy, before Plato and Aristotle and Epicurus and whatnot. And I thought that was a very interesting point, and a couple anecdotes kind of came up for me that speak to what's going on with communicability and the sensus communis. And so, for example, you have the stories of Aesop. Aesop was apparently mute originally, but then he was blessed by one of either two goddesses. It was either Tuke, chance, or Polyxenia. And that, Polyxenia means like open to the maximal strangers. And it was only when being blessed by them that he got his power to communicate. That this power to communicate relates to him being engaged in the transcendent sphere of communicating with animals. And I think that's a really important way to think about it. There was another example of that I wanted to mention, and I'm forgetting which example it is, and that's all. So that's all. If anyone is interested in how this relates to the sort of pre-Socratic experience, and this is where we ultimately end up. That's all.
Thank you. I'm not sure. That's a great comment. I'm not sure what to do with it.
That's okay.
But thank you for it. I'm going to move on just because we have a lot of people still waiting and only about 15 minutes, but thank you, Rachel. Ken.
I got a little lost there with Rachel's comment. I hope I can remember what I was going to say, but I think part of the discussion and the questions that were being raised rest on like separating out taste from the impartiality of judgment. I think that taste, she calls it to be the vehicle for judgment. And I think I would say, she says we're judging all the time. I don't think she would say we're doing it well or that we're doing it impartially, but I think we're judging all the time, and we're judging in a way that aligns us with our sense of community. And in the example that Adolf brought up in the beginning, if the whole community is upside down, like in Hitler's Germany, then that alignment with the community makes us upside down as well. And it's very hard to find the impartiality that could lead to anything like the beautiful. I think that's why that example, the question you raised, was so difficult. But I think just in terms of our discussion, if we separate taste out from it seems like judgment's pulled in different directions. It operates through taste, she calls it the vehicle, but what comes into it and the part that we're trying to make impartial is what is coming in through the imagination. And that is the representative, the objects that are represented, but the particulars that are represented. But it seems like if we keep those poles in mind, it seems like the discussion's easier to make. That's all.
Thank you, Ken. What was the first example you gave? Or oh, I was going to say something and then I blanked. I'm sorry.
First example I gave, and it was a long time ago.
All right. Anyway,
I can't remember. I don't remember what I said either.
okay. I'm sorry. I just gonna move on then.
No, please.
Vigdis.
Yes, I'm going to look at from 12th session, and where she says about what are the standards of the operation of reflection. And this is because I think when you come to judgment, there is a process of judging over and over again. And what she says is the operation of imaginations has made the absent immediately present to one's inner sense. And this inner sense is discriminatory by definition. It says it pleases or it displeases. And it's called taste because, like taste, it chooses. And then comes, but this choice is itself subject to still another choice. One can approve or disapprove of the very fact of pleasing. And this too is subject to approbation or disapprobation. I think that's a very important part of it, because you have this immediately judgment by taste. You approve, it pleases or it displeases. But if you then, as she cites on page 71, goes to the maxims of the sensus communis, and you use these, you think for yourself, the unprejudiced ways of thinking, and you put oneself in thought of the place of everyone else, the maxim of enlarged mentality, and then the maxim of consistency, then you can judge over and over again, and you get in new, this enlarged mentality would grow, and you take your judgment and you go over this again, both in, I think this is also a way that judging and thinking plays in a kind of way you both judge and you think, and you judge and you think. So that's how I think we actually use judgment. If we judge as Kant says, or as I also think Arendt says, in this enlarged mentality makes us willing to think in others' place. And it's also that where we come to this disinterestedness that's important. Does this make?
Yeah, and I think that's all right. And you reminded me of what I wanted to say to Ken as well, which is that, and it fits with what you're saying as well. Ken said earlier, we make judgments all the time. And I think that's right and wrong. Most of the judgments we make all the time are what we call prejudgments or prejudices, which are not thoughtful judgments. And so what Vigdis is now reminding us is that for Arendt, a judgment can be more or less thoughtful, more based in prejudice, or more based in these conditions or these criteria for judgment, which are independence of thought, the enlarged mentality, and consistency. And it's those to make, if we were to try and make those kind of judgments at every moment of the day when we needed to make a judgment, we would go crazy and it would not be possible and we would never move anywhere. And so most of the time we more or less rely on prejudices. And that's just necessary and human. But politics for Arendt is the actual questioning of our prejudices and deciding where and when to take those prejudices and try and complicate them and replace long, stale, common judgments with new judgments that we will try and woo people to. So thank you. That was really helpful, Vigdis, and I hope it helped me allow to say something back to Ken's question as well. Was that helpful? Is that where did I get it right?
Yeah, I think so. And I also think it might relate a bit to when this very popular book, Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, has something to do with the same, that we're thinking fast is the unprejudiced. When you talk about unprejudiced, what we go, I mean, we go on, the prejudiced,
Yeah.
when we just act in the world and don't think so much about it. But the slow thinking is when we just take this round with going to the imagination and using these maxims to think about that before we make up our minds. So just to say, I think there's some similarities there.
Great, thank you. Gilbert. Gilbert, are you there? All right. Gilbert, last time. Stephen.
All right, well, thank you. I'll be brief. I want to go back to the question of the basis for love of the world. And last time we spoke, I asked you, well, Kant thought that we had to believe in progress in order to do something for the world, because otherwise we wouldn't see the fruit of our efforts.
Right.
And I said, well, Hannah Arendt did not believe in progress. What motivated her? And your response was her sense of natality and plurality. Well, I think that applies to love of the world here, but thinking about what you said, I'd take a little farther in this context, and the example is birth. And she saw that as a miracle in a secular sense, although perhaps informed by the theological studies she did. She wrote at one point that our existence is a miracle, the existence of the earth, of life, of human beings, that our existence rests on a chain of miracles, and that's something for which we can be thankful. And to my mind, that's at the core of love of the earth.
I think it's great. Yeah, I think it's nice that you brought up the progress verse amor mundi, or natality, or spontaneity, or meaning fullness, which we've talked about in the past, and how she opposes progress with this sort of gratitude for the meaningfulness of the world, and tying that into birth. That she talks about two births, right? There's the literal birth, and then there's the second birth into the world, through language and through becoming part of the sort of human order of the world. And so I think I'm not sure. I was trying to think which birth you are actually referring to, whether it's the literal birth of a human being, or the second birth into a world. But I think it's probably the latter. I'm not sure. In any case, yeah, I think that's it does bring us back to the opening question from Adolf about why we judge to love the world in spite of the horrors and evils in it. And her answer is not progress, but a kind of belief, judgment of the beauty and meaningfulness of living a life with others in the world amongst plurality. I think that's well put.
Thank you.
All right. Monica, you get the last question. You've got 2 minutes.
Oh, thank you. Okay, well, I guess something that's interesting to me is I feel like there's a lot of phenomenon lately, or trends, like things happening on the internet, space exploration, the things you've discussed before, like the singularity, automation, genetics, all these sort of grand projects that are hard to understand as phenomenon and hard to create an example for understanding them. So I think it's interesting that she has this idea of using the imagination to come up with examples or schemata to understand this, but also I feel like the trend is a bit in society to look at these things and sort of be frozen as to how to understand them quickly enough to create judgments that could lead them to a place that could create a world we want to live in. That's my 1 minute version of the question.
So how do we create judgments or images about a world we want to live in? Is that the question?
Well, given these trends seem so fantastical and new, so they sort of defy prior examples, or would seem to defy prior examples, something as grandiose as the internet, or people spending $55 million to go to space, or etc. These things that seem sort of beyond our capability to understand quickly enough to judge quickly enough.
Well, I think a lot of that goes back to the question of art, right? And that's the productive as opposed to the reproductive imagination. I mean, I think most real change happens because artists, whether they are geniuses or more plotting, whatever, produce images, sounds, images, doesn't have to be visual images, but images, ideas that they introduce into the world. And when those images are taken up and embraced, when they woo people, and people start talking about them and thinking about them, they can reimagine the world. They can begin the process of reimagining the world. And I'm using the word artist loosely. These can be political artists, they can be visual artists, poetry, poet artists, musical artists, dance artists, all of the above. But it's the introduction of new ideas into the world that then provide new imaginations, new examples, that may allow the world over time to really shift. So I mean, that's the aesthetic politics that I think Arendt embraces. It's an aesthetic politics that people like Habermas rebel against because there's no truth in it, and it doesn't have who knows what that aesthetic politics could come from Donald Trump and people like him, and it can come from others as well. But the point is, because it's untutored and not subsumed under truth, there are for many people who find her idea of politics in this aesthetic way incredibly dangerous. And yet I do believe that's her argument, and I think it's the only one that one can embrace, because I think the effort to impose a kind of truth standard on politics and art is impossible and only leads to problems. But we'll stick with her. That's what she thinks. Thank you all very much. So just a reminder, for next week, we will have our final meeting talking about judgment. Not really, but for this session. And I'll be talking to Nick, who's our new postdoc at the Arendt Center. It's going to be fun. He and I may come up with a short text to have you read it. And so check out for your email. We'll see. But very much looking forward to talking to you next Friday, and enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and we'll talk soon. Take care.
Oh.